We must speak the truth about terror.
the truth about terror.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy
Let us never
theories
tolerate outrageous conspiracy
concerning the
theories
attacks of September the 11th.
concerning the attacks of September
Malicious
the
lies
11th.
that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists
Malicious
themselves.
lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Away from the guilty.
Away from the guilty.
To inflame ethnic hatred.
To inflame ethnic
Is to
hatred.
advance the cause of terror.
Is to advance the cause of terror.
They kill because they aspire to dominate.
They kill because they aspire to dominate.
They seek to overthrow governments.
They seek to overthrow
And
government
destabilize entire regions.
and destabilize entire regions.
And some governments, while pledging to uphold the principles of the UN,
And some governments, while pledging to uphold the principles of the UN,
have cast their lot with the terrorists.
have cast their lot with the
They
terrorists.
support them
They support them
and harbor them.
and harbor them.
And they will find that their welcomed guests
And they will find that their welcomed guests
are parasites
are parasites
that will weaken them
that will weaken them
and eventually consume them.
and eventually consume them.
For every regime that sponsors terror,
For every regime that sponsors
there is a
terror,
price to be paid,
there is a price to be paid,
and it will be paid.
and it will be paid.
Every nation has a stake
Every
in this
nation has a stake in this cause.
cause. As we meet,
As we meet,
the
the
terrorists are planning more
terrorists are
murder,
planning more murder,
perhaps in my country,
perhaps in my country,
or perhaps in yours.
or perhaps in yours.
We're taking new measures to investigate terror
We're taking new measures to investigate terror
and to protect against threats.
and to protect against threats.
The leaders of all nations must now carefully consider
The leaders of all nations must now carefully consider their responsibilities
and their future.
and their future.
Terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda depend upon the aid or indifference
Terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda depend upon the aid or indifference
of governments.
of governments.
They need the support of a financial infrastructure
They need the support of a financial infrastructure
and safe havens to train and plan and hide.
and safe havens to train and plan and hide.
Some nations want to play their part in the fight against terror,
Some nations want to play their part in the fight against terror,
but tell us they lack the means to enforce their laws and control their borders.
but tell us they lack the means to enforce their laws and control their borders.
We stand ready to help.
We stand ready to help.
Well, indeed, the papers here in London are going one step further and calling this a declaration of war on America. Are Americans waking up this morning and asking why, and how is President Bush going to answer those questions?
Well, this business of the declaration of war is very interesting. President Bush didn't use that kind of language in his address to the nation. He was more restrained. We've also had some restrained comments from the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Joseph Biden, who said the most important thing was to preserve civil liberties, not to play the terrorist game. And yet the comparison, for example, with the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 is being made all the time. The editorial in the Washington Post uses very strong language. It talks about a declaration of war. It says, if this assault originated overseas, it is not a question for law enforcement. It is an act of war and must be treated as such. We have an article by Dr. Henry Kissinger, talking about, also in the Washington Post, talking about the need to take out what he calls the global terrorist networks.
President Bush signs the Patriot Act into law, giving the federal government new powers to combat terrorism. President Bush signs the Patriot Act into law, giving the federal government new powers to combat terrorism. President Bush signs the Patriot Act into law, giving the federal...
Well, I'm a physical scientist, so I look at it from the point of the physical evidence. And when you're going to solve any crime, you first must begin with what happened. You need to establish what happened before you can establish how it happened, and that before you can establish who did it, and that before why they did it. And there's so much rush to incriminate or point fingers at somebody for doing something before it's even known what got done. But once you know what happened, then you can start figuring out the other much more clearly. A weapon of this kind of destructive capabilities, very limited probably as to who did this. So, if you start out saying, oh, it was bombs in the building, you're not going to get to the right answer. It's the wrong premise. So that's why it's important to figure out what happened, and that's what I focused on, the forensic study of the evidence. which is why here we are 11 years. The truth is known. It isn't like, well, we'll never know the truth. No, the truth is known, but why don't people find it? Because they're satisfied with hanging on to groupthink or worried about the implications. And they don't want this to be true, so they deny that it exists.
The World Trade Center was built at an astonishing rate. 3 floors every 2 weeks. Steel came from all over America and beyond, arriving just in time to be hoisted to a new home in the sky. Efficiency was a buzzword taken seriously by everyone on the team, especially project managers.
Search for remains continued. Investigators were looking for evidence that might lead to the identification of a victim. A broken watch, a fragment of a credit card,
and you've been watching special
a
extended
human
coverage
body part,
of
such as a
America.
hand,
Again,
that could be
President Bush will be
fingerprinted.
heading to the New York area to personally
A few
inspect the
victims
damage
might be
at
identified
what was
by
the World
traditional
Trade Center
methods,
site. Our coverage will continue
such as
tonight.
jewelry, tattoos, and dental records. Most would require a DNA match. At the Bodie Technology Group in Virginia, thousands of files, each representing an extinguished human life, began to arrive. One by one, they were logged into the computer tracking system. They were shipped to Virginia because the New York Medical Examiner's Office, the city agency responsible for victim identification, could not handle the volume.
Announcing a ban on civil flights flying over London, he was resolute in his solidarity with the United States.
We put a process in place, and we were able to process 1,000 bones in the first week. And that is something I believe that's never been done before by any forensic lab anywhere in the world.
At Bodie Technology, there were 13,000 files to analyze. Each file contained what investigators believed were the
FBI,
of a
within the last
victim.
couple of years, has launched a
Technicians
very
would try to
aggressive
link those
media
fragments
campaign
to a name,
telling people
a
that
face,
Washington, D.C.
identity.
was right to be a target for terrorist attacks.
But there is the sense from some of these groups that there are no front lines in our country. Civilians, children are targeted by Israel, by other nations, by the United States when we attack Iraq. So the United States and Americans should feel what it's like to have no lines in their land.
Yes, and there's also the feeling of revenge. And what's really important to understand with these, particularly young individuals who get incorporated into the group, this is killing in the name of God. It becomes a sacred obligation under an extremely radical interpretation of the Quran that they are in fact defending their faith against the unbelievers and retaliating for injustice.
Unwashed drinking cups, and other personal effects of the dead.
Discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
So, if you start out saying, oh, it was bombs in the building, you're not going to get to the right answer. It's the wrong premise. So that's why it's important to figure out what happened, and that's what I focused on, the forensic study of the evidence.
And the Boston airport. And ABC's Lisa Stark has been reporting through her sources, aviation sources.
Interestingly, as Brian Ross touched on earlier, and we've been able to confirm, it was a fellow airline passenger who got in a traffic dispute with these men who were apparently late for their flight, which is why their luggage didn't make it, who then made his flight, heard the news about what happened, and called in on his cell phone to the Massachusetts State Police. That car was processed last night about 10:30, 11 o'clock at Logan Airport by the Massachusetts State Police bomb squad that's assigned to the airport, their dogs, the FBI's evidence response team, and one of their bomb techs. The dogs did not react for explosives in the car, but that's not really the object here. This wasn't a bombing. They were using the plane as their projectile, as their explosive.
Even if it inconveniences
among the ironies from the scene last night.
I don't want a confusing picture to be on the screen, so let me went through the bomb pictures, which are very pointed. The fire is still burning in the Pentagon, but it is shaken to our core. And I remember Tom Foley and others, leadership in the Congress going through and saying, okay,
waves,
what does it
Mark,
take to
presumably
protect
the
this
shock
building?
waves still
And people
reverberating
say, look,
across the
you're right
American
on the
nation.
street, you can attack this building,
Absolutely.
it can be done.
I mean, this is, to say
And
it is
the congressional
unprecedented
leadership says we
would be
can't do that.
a
We
slight
can't shut
understatement, to
everybody
say the
out. We
least.
can't
This
clamp
is
down,
called
because
the
if we
Second
do,
Pearl Harbor.
we
Had
have
an
changed the very
isolated
nature
incident
of our
in
society.
Oklahoma City.
That's correct.
Yes,
And you're
there was
going to
a
have to
bombing
change
at
the
World
very
Trade
nature of
Center.
your society, but
Ford
not
Commercial
essentially.
Airlines,
You will never
Pentagon,
stop
which is
being
the
the
military center
freest.
of the nation, and the financial capital of the world, New York City. If this was on a movie, people would walk out of it because they would feel that it was a cause for here.
How long do you think before America becomes
Well, I don't think they'll ever come to
When
terms
you
with
can
it. I
say
think
to a
everybody
family,
they
here are your
did
names, it
that
does
they
bring
did.
very
The only thing I can
closure
compare it to in my life is the assassination of John F. Kennedy. That is the significance of it, where you have the president returning to Washington, where you didn't know for some time where he was, and then people are still very tense about if there are going to be further attacks. We have this sort of sense of invincibility, that things that happen all around the world won't happen to us.
You've been watching special
Now,
extended coverage
there is
of
a
attack
certain
on America.
psychological
Again,
terror.
President Bush will be heading to the New York area to personally inspect the damage at what was the World Trade Center site. Our coverage will continue in a moment. Our coverage will continue in a moment.
Mr. Bush rallied exhausted rescue workers, pledging those responsible will pay a heavy price.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
The defiant words hit home with firefighters who have spent frustrating days searching the wreckage amid dimming hopes that any of their comrades will be found alive.
Discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it. You're discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake what comes next. Your armed forces, but make no mistake about it. Your armed forces.
They weren't there, you know, to looking at the wedding bands, and looking at the wedding bands and hoping there was engraving, and seeing the engraving, seeing all these tender little things that people wrote on there.
I was reluctant to go. They had platforms for the family. I was very ruins.
Some 260 people on board the planes are assumed dead. The American Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said the Pentagon was functioning and was open on Wednesday. He said the United States was in no way connected to explosions.
The collapse occurred by first the exterior columns buckling outward, and then as they buckled outward,
announcing a ban on civil flights flying over London, he was resolute in his solidarity with the United States.
Tilted a little bit.
We therefore here
the entire top of the building started
stand shoulder to
straight
shoulder
down,
with our American friends in this hour of tragedy. And we, like
information from family members as well as Pentagon employees. U.S. officials, meanwhile, are saying the evidence is mounting as to who is behind these
sources are telling ABC News that at least 5 suspects identified as Arab men have been identified as suspects in the 2 hijackings that originated here at Logan Field. These sources are also telling us that the hijackers were armed with box cutters or some kind of makeshift knife with a plastic handle, and that they began attacking as a way to lure pilots out of the cockpit, saying how exactly the 5 more suspects were distributed over those flights, flights 175 American 11 Logan about 24 hours ago. They say suspects started 5 of them.
And a retaliation of some kind is likely to happen sooner as opposed to later, larger and
so weakened by fire that when a corner of the AC-4 collapsed, it started to change.
Chanting, singing.
like this is some type of
The collapse occurred by first the exterior columns
to bring to justice
those responsible, to retaliate wherever it is. As they buckled outward, the tower began to come down on the east side and tilted, and then after it had tilted a little bit, the entire top of the building started moving straight.
When you did it previously, you showed that the floors actually pancaked. And we did not see any evidence of pancaking in the videos or photographs we have.
Investigators were still collecting all the usual physical evidence.
Rental car Secretary of Defense William Cohen, Chairman and CEO of the Cohen.
What George Stephanopoulos was just telling us information he had received. Sources are telling ABC News that at least 5 suspects identified as Arab men have been identified as suspects in the 2 hijackings that originated here at Logan Field. And sources are also telling us that the hijackers there makeshift knife with a plastic handle, and that they began attacking and or killing flight
indicating that we could anticipate acts of terrorism, destruction,
We're going to go back to Good Morning America. We'll see you again in about
so it doesn't change the size.
What George Stephanopoulos was just telling us information he had received. Sources are telling ABC News that at least 5 suspects identified as Arab men have been identified as suspects in the 2 hijackings that originated here at Logan Field. And these sources are also telling us that the hijackers were armed with box cutters or some kind of makeshift knife with a plastic handle, and that they began attacking and or killing flight attendants as a way to lure the pilots out of the cockpit. They're not saying how exactly these 5 or more suspects were distributed over those 2 flights, 9 and 175 and American 11, which left Logan just about 24 hours ago. But they say suspects, at least 5 of them have been identified. Meanwhile, a automobile, a vehicle, a rental car,
over 99% of the steel in the World Trade Center buildings was quickly shipped to Asia and melted, recycled. This evidence from a crime scene was destroyed over the objection of many scientists and engineers.
And some governments, while pledging to uphold the principles of the UN, have cast their lot with the terrorists. They support them and harbor them. And they will find that their welcome guests are parasites that will weaken them and eventually consume them. For every regime that sponsors terror, there is a price to be paid. It will be paid.
Thinking about the fact that in that car, as we were just told by John Miller, they found a video on how to fly a commercial plane. I don't know why it strikes me as such a stunning,
an instructional video on how to fly a commercial airplane and a fuel consumption calculator. Charlie?
Pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief. Terrible sad. Quiet.
We are all dealing, of course, with images here. We're seeing the images burned in our minds and in our hearts. We saw yesterday an experience in our World Trade Center. The destruction is fire. The destruction is fire.
A great people have been made a great nation. Terrorist attacks and shaking the foundations of our biggest buildings. But they cannot touch the foundations of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot damage the steel of American resolve.
We are all dealing, of course, with images here. We're seeing the images burned in our minds and in our hearts of what we saw yesterday and the experience at the World Trade Center, the destruction and fires, the tragedy, the loss of life. The destruction and fires, the tragedy, the loss of life.
We are all dealing, of course, with images here. We're seeing the images burned in our minds and in our hearts of what we saw yesterday and the experience at the World Trade Center, the destruction and fires, the tragedy, the loss of life.
All dealing, of course, with images here. We're seeing the images burned in our minds and in our hearts of what we saw yesterday and the experience at the World Trade Center, the destruction and fires, the tragedy, the loss of life.
the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty. To inflame ethnic hatred is to advance the cause of terror. They kill because they aspire to dominate. They seek to overthrow governments and destabilize entire regions. And some governments, while pledging to uphold the principles of the UN, have cast their lot with the terrorists. They support them and harbor them. And they will find that their welcome guests are parasites that will weaken them and eventually consume them. For every regime that sponsors terror, there is a price to be paid.